Two guys have entered my room with handguns and shotguns.
I'm trying to save my dying son.
But it was like that I was locked in a story that I couldn't rewrite.
This would not be my life forever.
There was a good chance I was not going to survive at all.
And that same evening, I shot him.
I said to her, I think I can forgive you.
I'm Zio Bookbinder, and this is Imagine Justice, where we tell true stories about what happens after harm is done. These stories often include gun violence, death, child abuse, and sexual assault. Please take care in listening. These stories are told by the people who lived them.
My name is Stacey Lannert. My middle name's Ann, and a lot of times I actually prefer to be called Stacey Ann Lannert. I was 18 years old when I committed the crime, and I didn't actually get sentenced. I spent 894 days in jail. It took over 2 years to take me to trial. So I spent a good 2 years just in jail, just waiting to find out my fate. And then went to trial. It was a week-long process, and then was found guilty of first-degree murder. And in Missouri, when you have a first-degree murder charge, there's only two, and it's a guilty answer. Then there's only two possible outcomes. One is death penalty, which the prosecutors have to file for within the first 6 months. And the second outcome is life without parole. So I was sentenced to life without parole. And it was just very overwhelming because there was a lot in my background. The person who I shot was my father, was my natural father. He was sexually abusive towards me since the age of 8. When I turned 18, I thought, all this is going to end. I'm an adult now. He's got to stop. I can leave. And that didn't wind up happening. On July 3rd, he raped my younger sister for the very first time. And that same evening, I shot him, and he died. So I felt like there were mitigating circumstances in the crime, and that a life without parole sentence wasn't just. Right? Like, here's someone who had taken my childhood and the majority of my life since the age of 8, and now they're wanting me to spend the rest of my life in prison because of it. When I compared my case to other people's cases where they would get a 20-year sentence for taking the life of someone they didn't know or of a child, and it was just, I didn't understand. I had a really hard time understanding how my sentence was just. So from the very beginning, I sort of felt like maybe someday this will change. And if it does change, if I ever get the opportunity to be free, I want to be a better person. I want to understand what led me here. I want to break down the walls of silence that made me feel like I was trapped. And I feel like while I was incarcerated, I really worked on becoming a better me. And during that time, I also went through numerous appeals processes, and that's kind of where I began to start learning about the law, because I didn't understand how I couldn't be given a defense. The only defense that was available to me at the time that I went to trial was mental disease or defect, meaning that I didn't know what I was doing because I had a mental disease, and that didn't really qualify. I knew what I was, I knew, even though I felt like I couldn't kind of control it, if that makes any sense at all. Because there was no denying that, yes, I did this. It was more a question of, why did I do this? And the head prosecutor at the time was very against me being allowed to use the battered women syndrome. He had said that my father was an alcoholic and he was a violent man, but that didn't make him a rapist. I was having a really hard time finding my voice and being able to explain the things that I had lived through. And this was all back in 1990 too. So we didn't have as good a grasp on the consequences of sexual abuse then as we do now. It does still happen. And the problem is so many people they try to put themselves in the shoes of the person who's going through it. And they tell themselves, well, I would have left. Well, I would have done this. Well, I would have done that. And I always tell people, you cannot make sense of the nonsensical, because when someone is being abused on that level, it is nonsensical. And rational thought doesn't prevail. Survival does. And things people do to survive don't always make sense. I had to do psychological evaluations because mental disease and defect was on the table. Plus, the battered women syndrome was at first on the table, and my attorney had secured an expert for us. So I had to undergo an evaluation. And part of that evaluation, the person who evaluated me gave me the Courage to Heal workbook and made it a part of my evaluation, because she knew if she gave me the workbook, I wasn't going to do it. Right? Like, I've spent over a decade denying to myself that any of this actually happened. I'm not going to work through what I lived through. But that Courage to Heal workbook really started the healing journey for me and really helped me. I can't even begin to state what it did for me. It put me on a path where I began realizing, hey, maybe this isn't my fault. You know, I wasn't raped because I said the wrong thing or I turned on the light. No, it's because this person, my father made this choice, not me. And, you know, a survivor tends to have shame heaped on top of them because they didn't overturn this stone, because they didn't go to great lengths to end the abuse. And in my case, I had told people. I had told a babysitter when I was 12. There was a psychologist that I had seen that knew. I felt like people did know and that they weren't helping me and I was alone. And, you know, when we know better, we do better, right? And so since that time, I've really advocated for communication, for erasing the shame around sexual abuse so that we don't continue to heap it upon the people who have lived through it. No more, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? Because to me that tilts the shame towards the survivor, and it needs to be more of just a organic understanding. This happened. What can we do to make it better? Right?
Did your sister have to take the stand in your trial?
So my sister was actually charged also. She was charged with conspiracy to commit murder. I was charged with first-degree murder. She wound up taking a plea bargain way before I ever even went to trial. She got a 5-year sentence for conspiracy to commit. And she was released from prison the week before I went to trial. And when she was released, they sent her to a halfway house, and they told her that if she participated in my trial, that could be a violation of the condition of her parole. And so she didn't testify. And, you know, I didn't want to add more on top of her. She was 15 years old when she went into prison. She was just getting out. She was just starting her life. And I didn't want her to have to relive it, even though I'm certain she did, right? But it was just as hard on my sister and my mother with me being sentenced to life without parole as it was on me. And I know people may not understand that, but they felt like there were so many failures all the way around. Like my mother and my father divorced when I was 12 years old. And so then they wound up sharing custody. We went back and forth a little bit. There's a whole book about it. Anybody can read it. It's redemption. But my mom wound up remarrying and moving to Guam. And so she felt like, and she had been abused herself by her father. And so she would confront my dad about it. And my dad would just tell her that she was crazy, that she was seeing things, that she was just, making her past mine. And so my mom wound up thinking, well, he loves his girls. He drinks, but it's fine. Since then we've had a lot of forgiveness all the way around, right? And my family's really just finally starting to heal.
Yeah. And this happened, you said 1990 was the year the trial happened, or the year?
Yes. No, 1990, July 4th, 1990 was the day I was charged. And
okay.
then I didn't actually go to trial until November of 1992, and I was sentenced in December of 1992. I had an appellate attorney provided for me by the public defender system, and she filed my appeal. We lost. She filed another appeal. We lost that too. I think she was filing the third appeal, and she finally came to me one day and she said, "Stacey, we're never going to win an appeal. We just aren't. The law's not on our side." But she said, "I don't think you should be here for the rest of your life. And if you would let me, I would like to file a clemency application for you."
This is Ellen Floatman.
Hey, Ellen, this is Zoe Bookbinder.
Hi, it's so nice to meet you.
Hi, you too.
So I'm a public defender in Missouri. Appellate cases come from our public defender trial cases, but we also get a lot of appeals from private counsel. Everybody who is convicted in a criminal case has an absolute right to a direct appeal from their conviction. So we will take their cases and file an appeal in one of the courts of appeals in Missouri or in the Missouri Supreme Court in some rare circumstances. In Stacey's case, her appeal went to the Eastern District Court of Appeals, which is in St. Louis. And so we file what's called a record on appeal, which is the transcript from the trial and all of the documents that might be necessary. And then we file what's called a brief, which is a written argument to the Court of Appeals. There's various other steps in the process. A lot of times there's an oral argument where we'll go and talk to the court about trying to get our client a new trial or a discharge. Stacey's case involved some instructional error that was pretty important to her conviction. It had to do with what's called battered spouse syndrome. Even though Stacey was a battered child, it's still called that, unfortunately, but it did apply to her case. We lost Stacey's appeal, and we tried to take it to the Missouri Supreme Court. They only take certain cases, and they don't have to take everything. You don't have a right to appeal to that court. So they did not take Stacey's case. She actually managed to get some representation in federal court and had both the Federal District Court and the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals look at her case. And then we even tried to get the U.S. Supreme Court to take it. And she lost all of those appeals.
To be granted an appeal, it's way more about technicality than it is about fairness or justice, right? Like something has to technically go wrong, or someone has to make a sort of a mistake in the courtroom, right?
Yeah, and I think it's about both. I mean, we think of things as technicalities, but really what those are things that made the trial not fair. So it is about fairness and justice. So if you're talking, say an objection was overruled at trial that should have been granted, if it was something that had to do with some evidence, people hear the word hearsay or best evidence or things like that. But what we're really talking about is something came before that jury that made the trial not fair. And that's what we have to establish on an appeal, is that the trial wasn't fair because of something that happened at the trial, some evidence that should have been suppressed because the police didn't handle it right, or an evidence that an objection that should have been granted that keeps some evidence out that should have come in, or some evidence in that should have been left out. So we really are talking about fairness and justice at the same time, but yes, there has to be something that you can point to specifically that happened in that trial that made it less fair. And and like I said, in Stacey's case, it was a jury instruction. The jury should have been instructed on battered woman syndrome, and they were not.
And even with that like technicality and that unfairness, she still wasn't granted an appeal.
Yeah, I mean, most are not. Being an appellate lawyer is frustrating sometimes because we want to think that the criminal justice system works, and I think for the most part it does. But those few cases where somebody didn't get a fair trial, we want to get them a new trial. We want to give them a fair shot through the justice system. And the best cases are the ones where we get somebody a new trial and then they're acquitted because it is more fair the second time. But it's pretty rare. We win maybe 5 to 10% of our cases is all.
Wow. And then with clemency, it's not about technicality at all, right? The governor,
right?
The governor or the president can do clemency, right?
Yes, and clemency has been called an act of mercy. What is unusual in her case is that we were able to file what's called a clemency petition with the governor's office. And why that's unusual, I guess, is not that you can file a clemency petition, but that I was able to represent her. Because as a public defender, I am limited by statute to certain things I can do with a client because the taxpayers are paying for that representation. And so I had to get special permission from my agency to represent Stacey in that clemency petition. But everyone who ever touched her case agreed that it was a travesty and a miscarriage of justice, and we needed to do everything we could to get her out of prison.
And I didn't understand what that really meant because I really didn't understand what clemency was in the first part. And in the second part, I don't know if you can hear it in my voice, but it still brings me to tears to this day. I didn't understand why anybody would want to do that for me, especially someone who knew all the things that I had done. I mean, this is my attorney. She knew everything. And why would she even want to do something for me that would help me? And it changed the way I looked at myself. I felt like if someone else could believe in me, then perhaps I needed to start believing in me. And it helped me really walk down this path of forgiveness because I think it was easier to forgive my father than it was for me to forgive myself. Because in my rational brain, how could I do this? How could I? Because along with the abuse, there's also love, right? There's love, there's hate, there's anger, there's fear. But at the bottom of it, there was love, and this was my dad. And no matter what, he would stand for me against everybody else that hurt me except for him. And it was just really hard for me to reconcile the fact that he was gone and it was my fault. So when Ellen was my attorney, when she came to me and told me that, I started just this really introspective walk. I started journaling. I started going through the Courage to Heal workbook again. I probably did it at least 3 times. In order to gain clemency, we had to have people understand why I made the choices that I made. And Mel Carnahan was the governor at the time, and he received a copy of my clemency petition, and he was in a Senate race with Governor Ashcroft. And we got word through one of his employees that, yes, he's looked at this petition. As soon as the Senate race is over, he's going to grant Stacey clemency. And so I just kind of, was trying to prepare myself to be the best me that I could be. And then 3 months before the Senate race was decided, Governor Carnahan perished in a plane accident. I remember being devastated for the state because this was a great governor, but not only for the state, but for myself, because what does this mean for me? And I felt so selfish asking that, but I couldn't help it. here I am serving life without parole. Here was this light at the end of the tunnel, somebody that understood and could make a difference in my life, and he just perished unexpectedly. And in my life, hope diminished at that moment. A new governor came in, Governor Holden, and Governor Holden's staff said, well, the prosecutor's still against her. My prosecutor was very vocal against me. And they said, we have a lot of political support against her. We need public opinion for her. And it's kind of like, well, how do you do that? You just give a press release and say, okay, here's my story. That's not how life works. So Ellen came to me and said, we need to do this. We need to create public support for you. And I'm going to start this website. So I had never even seen the internet. I went into prison when I was 19 in 1990. We didn't have Windows. We didn't have, that's just not how it was. Everything operated off of DOS, and, it was black screen with green writing. I had never seen the internet. And she wound up creating this website, freestaceyLannert.com. I don't remember if it was .org or .com, but a reporter was searching child abuse and my case popped up. And she wanted to do a story on me. And, my first inclination was no, I'm not doing this, because I'm not going to tell millions of people what I went through, what I did. There was still that shame of how could I have done this? How could I have allowed this to happen to me? How are people going to know? How are people going to look at me when they really know I was raped by my own father? And I didn't stop it, right? So I wound up doing the interview, and it was published in Glamour magazine. And then that led to multiple television interviews. Nancy Grace was one of my interviewers. She was working as a reporter for Larry King Live. Ellen and I argued about doing that one because I was like, there is no way I'm going to do this interview with Nancy Grace. I said, have you seen her on TV? She's a former prosecutor. She's not going to be empathetic in the least. And my attorney told me, she said, Stacey, just be you. Let people see your truth. And I did. And we received all kinds of support, just so much. And Governor Holden, I had 15 years in at this time. Was it 15? It was almost 15. I had 14 years in. And when Governor Holden left office, he said, I'm not going to answer this petition because I don't feel like she has enough time in. And I don't want to say no and give the wrong impression to the next governor. A normal life sentence at that time was you served 15 years and then you were eligible to see the parole board. So if he had commuted, all we were asking for was a life sentence, not a life without parole sentence, which ironically, the prosecutor offered me a life sentence. However, I would have had to have stood in front of the judge, accepted my sentence, and said that I committed this crime not because of the sexual abuse, but because of monetary gain, that I killed my father for money. And I was unwilling to do that, right? Because in that moment when I was sitting in jail, everything was stripped away from me. Everything. The only thing that I had was my truth. And I knew that if I had taken that plea bargain that would have meant eventual freedom, that I never would have been able to look at myself in the mirror again. I never would have been able to hold my head up. I never would have been able to accept myself as the person they were making me out to be. And so I didn't take the plea bargain and instead received the life without parole sentence. And that's all we were asking him to do, is please give me the sentence that you offered me when it would have been for monetary gain, when it would have been so much worse. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
We asked the governor just to commute my sentence from life without parole to a life sentence.
And sort of put it in the hands of the parole board. So you weren't even asking him to set you free, just give you a chance.
Right, exactly. We were not asking the governor to set me free. We were asking the governor, please just commute my sentence from life without parole to a life sentence, which is what I was offered as a plea bargain if I had said that I did it for monetary gain and put it in the hands of the parole board and let the parole board decide, have I been rehabilitated? So Governor Holden just did not answer my clemency petition. That was in 2004, and Governor Blunt was then elected. He was a Republican, and when he came in, I stopped doing all the interviews because I couldn't mentally anymore. I didn't see a psychologist while I was in prison. I was working with the dogs, and it was becoming a little overwhelming, not just to keep having to live through it again and again and again. And obviously the public support hadn't done that much good because Governor Holden just left me sitting on the table. So I really focused on just, once again, becoming the best me I possibly could and making the best of where I was, right? And that meant training dogs and working with at-risk juveniles. I taught aerobics. I was part of Better Living Awareness Support Team. It was called BLAST, and we help people realize that a healthy mind and a healthy body kind of go hand in hand. And so I was just tootling along, doing my prison term, and Governor Blunt was getting ready to leave office. He had decided not to run for re-election. When he came into office, he had given his State of the State address, and he was seeking the death penalty for child molesters. And I thought, here is someone who really understands the psychological effects of sexual abuse, because they understand that it takes so much away from the child. And I thought, perhaps I have a chance at clemency with him. And then Louisiana actually tried to impose the death penalty for child abusers, but then the Supreme Court wound up striking that down. So Missouri never wound up passing that law. And in his term, in his 4 years, we didn't really hear much from them. We would hear, yeah, we're aware of it, and that was about it. That was about all. And then at the end of his 4-year term, he had decided not to run again. And he announced on Thanksgiving that he was going to do a bunch of clemencies on Christmas Eve. So Christmas Eve came, we still hadn't heard anything. I was watching all these people that I knew had clemency applications in get these denial letters through the mail. And each day at mail call, I would just hold my breath thinking, all right, today I'm going to get mine. Today I'm going to get my denial. Christmas Eve came and I still hadn't had that denial. So I sat in front of the TV screen watching the news. And there were 12 people whose sentences were commuted or received clemency, but I wasn't one of the 12. At that moment, I had served 18 years. I was 36 years old. It was Christmas Eve. And that was the first time that it ever really sank in. I'm going to spend the rest of my life in prison. I'm going to die in prison. And for the first time, I became bitter. I was angry. I was devoid of hope. And I didn't really know how to exist in that moment. A friend had sent me a poem, and in the poem there was this line that I just kept repeating to myself. May you never hurt your whole self when parts of you are hurting. Because I was extremely suicidal. I had been suicidal before I committed the crime. I tried to commit suicide 3 times when I was younger. None of them obviously were successful. And then when I was 17, my grandma had passed away, and I had done this research paper on reincarnation. And I remember reading this book by Dr. Raymond Moody. And in it, they said that people who committed suicide were trapped on this plane of existence forever because they didn't realize that there was more beyond the body. And I just always remember thinking, no matter how bad this gets, I can't commit suicide because I don't want to be trapped on this plane of existence forever, right? Like, I need to see this through, whatever it is. And so that's part of what led to me committing this crime instead of just killing myself, one. And then being in prison, realizing I'm going to spend the rest of my life in prison. I left my little razor in my locker when I would take a shower because I didn't trust myself. but I didn't want to be trapped on this plane of existence forever. And I thought, well, even if I just, eventually die of natural causes, there'll be something else, something on the other side. And, God and I finally had, I was bitter and angry for about a week until I had my talk with God, that come to Jesus moment that some people describe. I had it. And all I asked God for was, if this is to be my life forever, then please help me feel how I felt when I had hope, right? Just give me that peace that hope had brought me. And I instantly felt lighter, like something was just lifted off me. And I was able to go back and resume life, right? I went back to training the dogs. I went back to being outside, feeling the sunshine. I had peace in my heart. And a Wednesday came and I got a little note and it said, call your attorney Ellen tomorrow at this time at this number. So I did. I waited till the next day. I called her on the prison phones, and I remember launching in to my spiel before she had a chance to even say anything. I was like, Ellen, I want you to know I'm fine. I know that you'll continue to work for me. You worked for me for over a decade. I know that this isn't the end. I know the next governor who had been elected, it'll be rough, but I have faith in you. I have faith in my higher power. I have faith in life, and I'll be fine. And I imagine she did this huge eye roll, and she said, Stacey, I really debated about whether to tell you this or not, but it's not over. And I said, what do you mean it's not over? It's over. He did his commutations. He's a few short days from walking. This is Thursday. He was scheduled to leave office on Monday. It's over. And she said, no, they called the detective so there was a detective in my case who had wrote this 25-page report detailing the abuse. The prosecutor had removed him from that case, told him to change his motive or he'd be removed. He was removed. That report was never turned over to the defense because it was outside the scope. So because it detailed the abuse, it didn't deal with what happened the night of July 4th and wasn't imperative that they turn it over. So he had been very vocal. This detective had been very vocal for me, had done interviews for me, had went to the governor's office for me, and Governor Blunt's office had contacted him. He contacted my attorney. Governor Blunt's office had also contacted my attorney. And she said, they're looking at it, Stacey. And, at that point, I was just grateful that there would be a yes or a no and that I wouldn't be left on the table again, because here's the one person that can make a difference in my life. And even just to be told no would have at least given me the knowledge that somebody looked at it and made that hard decision, right? Being left and being ignored was devastating. Because it seemed like nobody cared enough to even just say no. So that happened on a Thursday. Saturday, it was count time. I was sitting on my bunk reading a magazine because we weren't allowed to watch TV. And I was called to the rotunda area. Now, you never want to get called to the rotunda during count time because it means you are in trouble or somebody has passed away. Right? Like something big is going on if they call you to the rotunda at count time. So it's Saturday afternoon, 11:30 count time. They called me to the rotunda. The officer is an officer I don't know, which is unusual because I've spent years at this institution. And he hands me the institution phone. And there's a lady on the phone and she's telling me, Stacey, I need you to go call this number. And I didn't have a pen. So I asked the officer there for a pen. He gave me a pen. And she said, okay, hang up this phone and go get on the prison phones and call this number. And I said, well, ma'am, I can't because it's count time, right? Like they haven't counted me yet. I got to go back to my bed. And she said, when you hang up this phone, you go get on that phone. And I said, well, will you tell that officer this? And so she had me hand the phone to him. She told him she is to use the phones. And I hung up the phone. I went into the institution phones. I called a number I had never called before. And they play this little recording when the other party answers and it says, "This call has originated from an institution." And I didn't know who was on the other line. And then once the recording stopped and they pressed the appropriate number, I heard my attorney, Ellen, and she said, "Stacey, we got it." She said that he commuted your sentence from life without parole to 20 years, time served, immediate release. And I set that phone down and I just put my head on the table and cried. When I was able to speak again, I picked the phone up and I go, "Okay, what does that mean?" And she said, "I don't know. This has never happened. I don't know what it means." She said, "But I'll be trying to find out. And if you find out, you let me know." So I got off. I was like, okay. And I wound up getting off the phone because it was still count time. I had to be counted. And first I walked into the institutional bathroom, though, because I just couldn't take one more step. And I just cried. And one of my friends came into the bathroom and was like, "What's going on?" And I was just shaking. And I told her. And I remember walking in my room and I took one step through the door and just fell to my knees. And I just thank God, because I didn't know what it meant, but I knew that it meant that this would not be my life forever. And in the coming days, it meant exactly what it meant: immediate release. That Monday morning, the IPO, the institutional parole officer, walked into the rotunda. And I knew all staff members there, but I had never really engaged with the IPO because I was resentful. I'd see him and I'd be like, "Well, I'm never going to see you." So I just never said hello, never waved, never paid attention. And that day, I remember I was standing in a doorway and he came into the rotunda and I looked at him and I gave this nod like, "I'm going to see you someday. I don't know when that day is, but I'm going to see you." And then he pointed to me and motioned for me to come towards him. And I was like, "Me? You want me?" He said, "Yep, let's go to the back." And we went to one of the back offices and he's like, "Are you ready to do your home plan?" I'm like, "What do you mean? Don't I have to wait 6 months?" It was always procedure that even if you received clemency, you waited 6 months before the board decided to see you. He said, "No, Stacey, yours is time served, immediate release, and that's exactly what we're going to do." And I said, "But the governor, he's leaving right now. Like it's 11 o'clock. The next governor's being sworn in under an hour." He goes, "Well, when that man signed that paper, he was my boss. And we're going to do what our boss says." And they did the paperwork, and I walked out that Friday. I remember as I walked out, I was alone. I was alone on the walkway because they told me I wasn't leaving till 9 a.m., but they called for me at 7 to go report to the Bay Area to be released. And it was still dark outside, and I took that trek from my housing unit to the release area. And I mean, this was all I had known for the last 18 years. This was my home. This was where I felt safe. I know it sounds hard to believe, but I knew who I was here. And now I'm going to go someplace and I have no idea who I am. I don't have anything. I don't have a dime. I don't have clothes. I've never seen the internet. I've never held a cell phone. And then I just took a deep breath. I raised my head. I squared my shoulders. And I said, "You know what? Whatever I become, it's up to me. This is my chance. And I'm just going to follow my path." So I was only allowed one person to pick me up. And I had Ellen, my attorney, pick me up because she had fought for me for over a decade, and had thought outside the box. And so when it came time for that one person to be there, to watch me walk out that airlock, I thought, this person who gave so much of herself really deserves to be there. So Ellen picked me up, and we met the rest of my friends and family at a little restaurant like 2 minutes away from the prison. The prison hadn't allowed any of my family and friends there because there was media there, and they didn't want it to create any chaos. So it was really nice. Ellen picked me up. We drove to this little restaurant, and the little restaurant knew we were coming. They'd opened up a little side room just for us, and all my friends and family were there. And I had been participating in this Bible study in the prison, and the ladies who ran that, they were there. And the restaurant had asked, well, what does Stacey want to eat? And the only thing I could think of was, I want a fruit salad. I haven't had real fruit. I can't tell you how long, and I just want fruit. So I had a fruit salad, and my mom was there, and she took me into the bathroom, and like, you know, now there's hand waving things on stuff, and kind of walked me through like, this has changed, but here's some of the things you need to know. And my sister and my brother-in-law were there, and I wound up actually living with my sister because my mom lived in the Illinois side and my sister lived in Missouri. It would have taken too long for me to do an interstate compact, so I went to live with my sister. So I had done 18 flat years, and I still had 2 more years of a sentence to do. So I was on parole. They didn't have time to approve an interstate compact for me to go live with my mother, so I wound up living with my sister in Missouri. I didn't jaywalk. I didn't speed. There was not a rule that I broke. People would actually make fun of me because I wouldn't jaywalk. I'm like, nope, I'm gonna wait for the light change, you know? And there was a lot of learning that I had to do when I first came home because I just didn't know. It was a different world. It was almost 2 decades. And a lot had changed in those 2 decades. So I followed a lot and just sat and watched and learned. Then I wound up doing a couple interviews, and then that led to an interview for Oprah. And that was interesting. Because I knew at that moment I had a choice. I could either really just live my life quietly and disappear into the background, or I could be this advocate for change, right? So I decided to do that interview so I could advocate for change. And that wound up leading to, I wound up writing a book. There was a lot of people who were interested in my story, and I wanted to be the one who told it. So that original author that did that first freelance report on me that was published in Glamour, she was my co-author, and we wrote a book, and it was actually published on Women's Day. Like, the release date was Women's Day, which is ironic because today is Women's Day.
Yeah.
So it was just very empowering. And once I had done that Oprah interview, there was a agent who had saw me on it and called me. I was in the middle of Kohl's shopping, and she called me and said, I'm an agent. I book lectures for to speak at colleges, and I think you could be extremely impactful and advocate for survivors everywhere. And I thought, I don't want to do that. She said, you said you wanted to change the world. This is one of the ways in which you can. I was like, you are right. Okay, how do we do this? So I wrote the book and toured giving lectures at colleges on sexual abuse awareness signs and domestic violence awareness signs. And I did that for a couple of years. And in between that process, I started going back to school because I knew I couldn't sustain that forever, like just mental health wise. I was seeing a therapist. I was getting the help I needed, but you can't live in the past. You have to move forward. So I wound up just taking a couple classes at a community college. I wound up being ready to transfer to a 4-year. I applied. When I put in the applications, I applied to 2 different state schools. One was Southeast Missouri State University, and I thought, oh, there is no way they're going to let me in because they asked, right? They asked, have you ever been convicted of a felony? And you had to disclose. And I thought, and the other school didn't. So I thought, okay, I'll get into the other school. I was in community college. I was taking a summer session course. And as I walked back, like we were being bombarded by cicadas. There's this season that Missouri has that we just have these huge cicadas flying all around. And it was hot and I was tired and exhausted because I was still working and teaching aerobics, and I had like 8 hours of class that day. And I remember walking out to my car, and my car was hot, and I put my books down and I'm thinking, why am I doing this? Why am I doing this? I'm never gonna become anything. I'm never gonna, my background is always gonna hold me down, and I'm never gonna be allowed to rise. So why am I even trying? And I picked up my phone and I had a message on my phone, and it was the Dean of Students from Southeast Missouri State University. And the message, I played it and it said, "Stacey, I just wanted to congratulate you. You've been accepted at SEMO. If there's anything we can do to help with your transition, please call me at this number. We're excited to have you." And I just broke right down right there on that steering wheel and cried, because the only thing that's ever going to hold me back is me. We have the opportunity to rise above, but if we shackle ourselves, that's just so sad, right? So devastating. So I chose that school. I went to that school, got my 4-year degree, and I majored in psychology and I minored in political science. And it was time for me to go on to graduate school, because you can't really, there's not a whole lot you can do with a bachelor's degree in psychology. And I remember thinking, well, do I really want to go to law school? You know, I had always kind of batted it around. Like, that was my goal. I'm going to go to law school. But I thought, okay, they're never going to let me in. And so I took courses. That's why I focused on psychology. When it came time to start applying, I took the LSAC test, and I just took it cold and thought, well, if I pass it, then this is where I'm supposed to be. And I passed, and I applied to law schools, and I was accepted. And it, you know, the rest is just kind of history.
So what was your first employment as an attorney? What did you do first?
So my first employment as an attorney was for the Missouri State Public Defender's Office. I mean, there was just never any doubt that I was going to work there, because how could I not, right? These are the attorneys that work for less pay, but are dedicated and had such an impact on my life. I mean, had I not had Ellen as my attorney, I wouldn't be here. I would not be free. I would still be sitting in a cell. And I know that.
Yeah.
I always say that prison is a place where hate laughs and love cries. Because it is cold. It is sterile. You're not allowed to touch. You're not really supposed to feel. How do you grow within that? Part of me became institutionalized. I followed the rules. I got in the rule books. I knew what would make me successful or not successful. I knew what I could do, what I couldn't do. And when I first got there, it was more just an exploration of, you know, I needed to learn who I was, because I wasn't being controlled. I was being controlled, but by a different system. It wasn't through fear. And I know that's hard to understand, but I actually found freedom while I was in prison. And then when I had that bitterness that we talked about, you know, I was bitter because I would never really know love. I would never have a dog of my own. I couldn't even eat a grape if I wanted to. But those were all external things, right? In my heart, I was free. In my heart, I was free. And people can't take that away from you, no matter where you are, even if you're surrounded by barbed wire. And yes, I had a lack of choice, but I did have some choice. And they might have been ridiculous. It might have only been what color of socks I chose to wear that day, but it was my choice. It was also my choice how I chose to react to stuff. You know, I learned about my power, because if I chose to react to somebody, then I was giving them my power, right? So there's freedom even behind bars if you are lucky enough to find it. Now, of course, none of that compares to out here, right? None of it. And there are many people in prison who do not deserve to be there. But I also think it is what you make of it. And fortunately, I was able to grow and find my path to healing. I think that when you're living with abuse, you feel like people can just look at you and know, right? Mm-hmm. Which isn't true. We don't have this sign. We think we do, but we don't. And anytime somebody would ask, the first couple times they'd ask, you're going to say no, just because you don't want to admit it, you don't want to deal with it. And I hope that if nothing else, that I really convince people, if you think there's something there, keep asking. It doesn't have to be one right after the other. You know, it could be a few weeks, a few months, but continue to ask and just let that person know you're there for them, because they need you. They need you more than you can even begin to realize.
So the theme of this podcast is reimagining justice. And I'm curious, through your experience with the criminal legal system, as I like to call it, because justice is often left out of the equation.
Me too.
Yeah, Me too. Nice. I'm curious, what are the changes you want to see in that system, and how could you imagine it working in a way that really does leave room for justice to occur for everyone?
Wow, so that's a very loaded question, right? A very, very loaded question. One, I think we need to approach the criminal legal system differently. When somebody commits a crime, it doesn't just, very rarely does it happen due to true evil, right? I'm not going to say that evil doesn't exist, because of course it does. We do see it. But for the most part, there's crimes of addiction. Crimes of addiction, that person hurts themselves more than they really hurt society. So we've criminalized addiction when we need to come from a place of healing, right? What does this person need to heal? There's a lot of trauma that is at the base root of the criminal legal system. And I think that if we start to address that trauma, then we would have a different type of system, right? And unfortunately, like, I don't call the criminal justice system a criminal justice system because I don't feel that it's balanced. I don't feel that there's that balancing. I feel that, unfortunately, too many times the scales are tipped against the people who live with trauma, with poverty, with people who have a skin color of black or brown. And I think that's what we need to really look at. We need to look at these roots. The first time that somebody comes in for a possession, do we charge them, or do we try to help get them treatment, right? The first time that somebody comes in for a theft, well, why are they stealing? Is it a kid who's shoplifting because they might have been abused and this is how they express themselves? Is somebody shoplifting because they can't afford to feed their family? Is somebody stealing because they have an addiction and we need to address that root addiction? Why do they have an addiction? And if you look at the bottom layer of addiction, a lot of times it's there because there's trauma, right? In our society, we live with trauma. We live with trauma, but we don't teach others how to address trauma. We don't teach others how to heal. And part of that is because there's no easy answer. But another part of that is because services can be expensive. And as communities, communities need to invest in those services instead of just investing in jails and prisons. We can take people and we can put them behind a wall. We can put them behind that wall, but they're gonna, 9 times out of 10, come back into society. And we really have to ask ourselves, what kind of person do we want? And if we try to step in before we ever put them behind that wall, I think we'll come out with a much kinder society than just stuffing them in a concrete jungle.
Thank you for listening to Imagine Justice. I'd love to know what you thought of the episode. Please leave a rating and a review. I am Zio Bookbinder, the creator of this podcast. This episode was made possible with funding from Canada Council for the Arts. If you or someone you know has lived a story that you think would be good for this podcast, please visit zeobookbinder.com/podcast to make a submission. That's ZEOBOEKBINDER.com/podcast.